I was given the main title of the talk on disability and work in Canada, which is obviously the main focus of the conference. But before I go any further, I just want to say that as a visitor, I'm mindful that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I wish to acknowledge the important ongoing work that's going on in Canada right now in terms of reconciliation and moving towards a new, more positive, respectful relationship with Indigenous peoples. So thank you for the invitation and appreciate being here to visit. The main theme of my talk, which I have about 19 or 20 minutes to help set up for the panel this morning, is my main message for the next day and a half, I think, is framing a bolder vision. And clearly the conference organizers have set their own tasks to be one of that we need a new vision and a national strategy on the area of employment and disability in this country. And so they asked me to talk. Initially, I was to talk about achievements and successes of the last 25 years. Initially, the title was the last 150 years, marking the history of the country, and then looking ahead to the next 150. And I felt I certainly couldn't look 150 into the future, and I didn't think you wanted to hear 150 years history, either of work disability policy. I can recommend some sources for you to read on that if you wish. I mean, last evening and already this morning at that, what I thought was a fantastic panel of the employers. I want to thank them for sharing their ideas, their stories, their lessons, and the work they're doing in building momentum towards more inclusive, accessible workplaces in Canada. So I wanted to start off just posing, and I'm not going to answer all these questions in my address, but these are some of the thoughts or ideas that came to my mind. And I think the panel this morning already began to unpack the first one of what kinds of interactions do people with disabilities experience or encounter in workplace settings, and what's being done to improve those kinds of experiences. The second question is really the one that I really want to start from today, this morning. When I reflect back over the last 3 or 4 decades of efforts in this country in trying to enhance and improve the labor force participation rate of people with physical and or mental health disabilities, impairments, my own view is that we've had some successes, some pockets of promising practices, but that overall we've really seen marginal change. We haven't come, in my view, very far in 30 years. So why do labor market disadvantages and widespread experiences of workplace discrimination persist still for women and men with disabilities? How can we improve the distribution of quality labor force attachments, quality jobs for people with disabilities? And given the organizations that are behind this conference, what's the role or future role of work disability policy in this country? I think these are questions for everyone who's gathered here to think about, whether you're a government official, you're from organized labor, business, management, Indigenous organizations, people with disabilities and families, health professionals, or researchers, as some of us are here up on the stage today. So I look forward to having some frank and thoughtful discussions, and I look forward to hearing people as we take stock and we build the case for major social change to move forward towards a new vision and a new strategy for work and disability policy. Now, let me start with three propositions, really, for your consideration. Again, not just for, as I said already, I think we know from the statistics, and some of the other panelists will mention some of these, we do know that people with disabilities are more likely to be outside the labor force than Canadians without. They're more likely to be unemployed. They're more likely to be concentrated in certain occupations in industrial sectors. Not all of them, but some of them. They're less likely to be in management or professional occupations. They're less likely to be employed full-time, full year. They're more likely to be in part-time involuntarily. They're also more likely to not have the same average employment income as other Canadians. And there's those issues of employment discrimination that also are quite startling. So I won't dwell on statistics. Those will be coming from other speakers today and through tomorrow. But it's really by way of saying my first proposition is that we need far-reaching or fundamental change, not just in attitudes, but also in the way that community organizations, economic organizations, and there I include for-profit, nonprofit, social enterprise. We need some fundamental changes in the way we think about our public investments in labor market programming and other public policies and our everyday practices. We need to develop, secondly, a bold vision that requires reframing, I think. I think a lot of the guiding principles that we've had and that we've expressed in this country together in partnership through governments and other organizations and business and labor are good principles. But we need to rethink them and sort of dust them off and polish them up. We need to deepen our aspirations. We need to recommit to some goals and objectives around employment. We need to think, as I think some of our speakers today already said, about the collective attention, the focus we should have, the priority attention we need to make in this area. And we need to work together cooperatively. Again, not to say we haven't, but we need to rethink and recommit to partnerships and networked action in this country. And the third proposition is about the future of work. And we've already heard a brief mention of artificial intelligence, which we're hearing a lot about how it might transform the future of work, not only in Canada, but around the world. We hear a lot of talk about predictions and thoughts about where the direction of work may be going. But whatever it may mean, it also means transforming what I call the many worlds of employment for people with and without disabilities in this country. So when thinking about employment in broad terms, a question that often gets asked is, what does the world of work look like? Or a related one is, what will the world of work become or look like in the future over the next 3 or 4 or 5 decades? My response in part is to say, well, actually, there are many worlds of employment. There is no one world of work. There are many worlds of work for all peoples, but here we're thinking about people with disabilities in particular. Again, for those who are not in the labor force, 45% of Canadians adult age in Canada are not in the labor force. That's more than twice as high as Canadians without disabilities. And age standardized, and we can do all that. But there's a major challenge there. The world of unemployment, we know. Employment preparation. We still have a history of adult day programs, social service agencies, and activity centers where people often are warehoused, again, kept detached from the labor force. The world of sheltered workshops, still far too prevalent in the country with various forms of segregated employment. And in some provinces, it's still legal to pay below minimum wage rates for people in sheltered workshops or enclave employment agencies. Some people, whether you're disabled or not, become career clients in training programs, spending years and years taking one training program after another, never really transitioning into real work. Work experience placements. I think, sadly, we don't have enough of these in the country. We need to, part of my vision would be that every person in high school in this country should have the opportunity to have 1 or 2 meaningful work placement experiences before they graduate. I'd also like to see the graduation rate for people with disabilities be comparable to those without disabilities. Supported employment, which is one of the more recent developments in truly integrated or inclusive workplaces. Affirmative action, employment equity, I'll go on, but in the interest of time, we can come back to these. But this is a slightly different way of thinking about the employment worlds than usually just saying precarious employment, good jobs, bad jobs, full-time, part-time. These speak to some of the history of the agencies, programs, and services that we've constructed over this last many, many decades, and that still persist. Some of these are part of the solution, some might be arguably part of the problem. But I was asked to talk about achievements and successes, so I better have a slide about some of the positives. And here again, you could pick your own list. Here's just some of mine. These are in addition to what I think we heard, from the employer panel. Some wonderful examples from Jazz and Deloitte and Dolphin and the others. One is that the poverty rate among Canadians with disabilities actually fell through the 1990s into the 2000s. I mean, it's still unacceptably high, but let's not lose sight of the fact that many of our income security programs and other measures have made the positive difference they've been intended to do. There's still a lot to do there, but I think that's worth noting. In 2013, the Government of Canada then had a panel report come out called Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector. This was the first time I can think of where a Government of Canada report made a sustained business case for employing people with disabilities, specifically in the private sector in this country. Employment first policies for people who are clients in social service programs and rehab programs, to talk about trying to focus on, as we heard already today, the capabilities, the talents, the skills that were there. That an organization in the social services sector, when it engages and interacts with a person with a disability, they should presume that there's an employment aspiration or opportunity there, and undergo case management in that sort of philosophy. That's being taken up in various parts of the country. The Ready, Willing, and Able initiative by Canadian Association for Community Living and the Autism Spectrum Disorders Alliance. They've got some very promising results rolling out of their data on evaluations on that. I'm aware of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, who has, in the last few years, taken up again a more proactive stance, a more of a systemic discrimination approach, and is starting to look more seriously at the whole area of mental health and employment in the country. And then there's the planned federal legislation for accessibility, or what was being called the Canadians with Disabilities Act, but it probably won't be called that, but it'll be called something around accessibility. Following in the steps of the Ontario legislation in 2005, the Manitoba legislation in 2013, and Nova Scotia recently passed in April 2017 an Accessibility Act. So the Government of Canada will be tabling a bill in the House of Commons, I expect probably in the spring, late spring, and that will again re-energize a conversation nationally within the federally regulated portion of the Canadian labor force, which is only about 7 or 8% of the labor force, but strategic sectors, transportation being one of them, banking, et cetera, but an idea that the Government of Canada will be there alongside at least some provinces showing some leadership. However, there remain, of course, ongoing challenges. And again, let me just point, where I live in British Columbia, these are ones that aren't just peculiar to my province, but the first one has very much been in our minds and in the news a lot in recent years. Under-resourced public education, teacher shortages and cutbacks that took place over the last 10 years, at least in my province, for teaching aids and other assistance for children with special needs, which is the term we still use, and a commitment to inclusive public education. And we've also, in a rather, I think, troubling situation of parents being afraid to speak out for fear of reprisals and cutbacks of services. Parents being told to sign non-disclosure statements by school boards. Things that clearly offend the Charter of Rights, but parents sign them because they want to get access or they've fought so hard. There's something wrong there. There's a patchwork of transition planning and employment preparation for youth with disabilities across this country. There's some very positive activities going on, but it's still very uneven and patchy. We could have a whole conference on disability supports and services, and I cite here a study recently done by Sherry Torgman of the Caledon Institute of the continued challenges of access, unaffordability, and just complexity in trying to navigate those systems. And within the nonprofit sector in particular, but also in the private sector, a challenge that employers face, as well as individuals with disabilities, is the complex maze of employment service agencies. Some who have some capacity and competence in dealing with disabilities and job accommodations, many do not. And there's a real need to look at strategically at how to either rebuild or build the capacity of those employment service agencies, or think of other ways we need to do this. How to connect employers and employees, or potential job seekers and employers in a more effective way. We heard the dolphin activities, I think, are very promising. That probably could get scaled up in one way, but there are other practices we're already doing that need to be rethought. And the need for new public investments. We can come back to that. So in developing a vision, so make sure that in doing a vision, we don't stay at 35,000 feet, which is kind of a nice place to look at occasionally, but we've got to come down from the clouds. I might be an academic, but I think the reason I get invited to meetings like this is that I like to work on the ground, too. I like to see real change. And I think part of the developing a vision then means getting down to brass tacks and talking about actual policy choices and issues that we have to make some trade-offs, we have to make some priorities, we have to kind of decide where we want to invest our time and energy and our leadership and our money and where not. So under labor market measures, the future of sheltered workshops. How do we transform or modernize the continued use of segregated enclave employment in this country, where I do recognize that for many people and for many parents, it's a safe place to send their kids. It's a form of respite for the family. And for some people, it's a form of meaningful work. But for many others, it's not. And for the disability movement in general, it's seen as a 19th century option in the 21st century for employment. There's other measures around supported employment, employment standards. Ontario just had last week Bill 148. It just begins to scratch the surface on where we need to go in a conversation in this country on modernizing employment standards and labor codes. It's interesting, it got so much applause. It shows you how little else is being done in the country when we get that excited about such a modest bill. That excited about $15 minimum wage in 2 years from now. That shows you how little else has been going on. A vision means higher expectations than that. A vision means we demand more of our public leaders. Income support programs. I won't go into those in any detail. Other speakers will be getting into those. Wage incomes. Again, we heard some references this morning. I'm glad the role of wage subsidies was mentioned by one of our employers. That's an important issue, whether it's for Giant Tiger or other employers. Again, within the disability community, that's a contentious issue, but we need to have that debate again. We need to look, of course, at not just minimum wage rates, but livable wages. The working income tax benefit. The Government of Canada is committing an additional $500 million to enhancing the WITB, as it's called. The details have not yet been worked out, I understand. We need to be part of that conversation as to how that could be allocated. And then the last point around a citizen's wage is the big vision around the idea of a basic income or a guaranteed annual income or an income of dignity and decency. And again, one of the interesting developments is the experiments or pilots being done in Ontario. British Columbia is about to launch one as well. So the message is that a bold vision requires a larger frame. I was trying to find an old picture of Michael Caine where he used to wear glasses about quite large, but I've come up with this. We need to widen our focus of aspirations, our goals, our attention, our actions. So this is really the last slide, and it's to say we need to shift. If we're truly going to transform and create a new vision, a new strategy, we need to shift our focus from looking at the unemployed individual disabled person and their risks and their limitations, and look towards the ability-disability relationship and the social context. It's not only just the skills and the talents of the person, but the skills and talents and commitments of the larger context. We need to move off looking at labor market agreements as the guiding documents for work and disability policy, and look at the UN Convention and Steve Esty, one of my panel members, will talk about that. Let's use the inspiring language and legal obligations that our government parties have committed to in this country. We need to move off of sheltered workshops and segregated forms of work to look at standard employment, but also supported employment and integrated social enterprises. Move off of the tendency too often in this country of governments looking at either labor supply measures or demand measures, rarely looking at them together. But in addition to that, looking at supply and demand along with the role of consultants, employment service agencies, business leaders, the connectors in society that will help make that supply-demand equation work in a more robust way. And I think we need to move off the language of reasonable accommodation, and we already heard some of that this morning from employer panelists, to looking at what I call progressive transformation to inclusion. And we need to move off relying on anti-discrimination laws that go on a case-by-case, complaint-by-complaint basis, and move upstream and look at systemic accessibility for all, whether we call that universal design or inclusion or full citizenship. But we need to be earlier in our interventions, more proactive and smarter. And that, to me, should be part of a vision and a strategy for our country. Thank you very much.